journalist revealed the abuse of power in Yanukovych regime. Our speakers are Dmytro Potekhin, Nonviolent Solutions Agency, and Yengeniya Kuznetsova, PhD, University of Deusto. Good afternoon, thank you for coming. First of all, I would like to thank Yengeniya Kuznetsova, who helped me with this research, and Media Pulse Agency. Thanks to their efforts, this research has become possible. I'm Dmytro Potekhin. I'm the founder and director of Nonviolent Solutions Agency, and this agency has implemented the project Yengeniya Kuznetsova, PhD. She defended her doctorate thesis in Deusto University, and her specialization is analysis of the text. Why it is important to talk about usurpation of power. Especially now, 2 years after Yanukovych disappeared from Ukraine, why this topic is still important, why we're talking about that. This is because till now the investigation is going on. It is mostly on corruption, and what we hear now are accusations in corruption. No one's talking about Yanukovych's regime usurping the power. We need to understand that there was the usurpation. Of course, this is just my opinion. It is important that such situations are not repeated again in Ukraine. It is important that in other countries where there are still problems with democracy, it is important that not just journalists but activists, lawyers understand how dangerous it is to hide such facts, and this is also important because when the law enforcement agencies switched to the side of the protesters, is a fact that there was this fighting against dictators without violence. In cases when the law enforcement were switching to the side of the protesters, it was happening without any violence, and there were fewer victims. It is important that law enforcers and everyone else know that the criminals are giving them orders, and for that it is important to inform everyone that the power in the country has been seized, so that people understand that all the orders are the orders of the criminal leadership, the leadership who are criminals, and that should be punished. Among other reasons, there's a big list of our motivations to conduct this research, but I would stop here, and I would like to suggest to proceed with explaining what was the methodology of the research. I'm Yengeniya Kuznetsova. As Dmytro has introduced me, I am doing content analysis of text. But first of all, I would like to mention that this is not an academic research, it's a publicistic type of research, but it's based on academic works on the research on the role of the media in the society, informing the events, personalities in the countries. A few words about methodology. Thanks to the Media Pulse Agency, we received a lot of data These were all mentions of usurpation in Ukrainian mass media starting from 2010, when Yanukovych usurped the power, until 2014. What were the ideas, how to work with this huge amount of data? That meant a lot of work, and for Ukrainian language there's no automatic system to analyze such big volume of text. So probably the main value of this survey is that we managed to analyze this huge amount of text, and we managed to divide all text into 3 groups. You can see it on the slide. These are the 3 groups. We don't see the percentage, but we divided all the mentions of usurpation into 3 groups. The first, that there was usurpation. The second one, that there is a threat of usurpation. That's 2010. And the third group, that there's no usurpation. We were ignoring other things like totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and others, because usurpation is the most volumetric and radical definition of what had happened, and we had no physical possibility to process all the amount of data. This is 2010, that's 2011. Here we see mass media talking more about usurpation as fact, but at the same time there are more mass media who say that there's no usurpation. But also the question is why the words of Tymoshenko or Yatsenyuk that there is a threat of usurpation, or we will not allow Yanukovych to usurp power, is an information event. But the conclusion of the Venice Commission on Usurpation of Power by Yanukovych is not an information event. We don't see any increase of the information of mass media after the opinion of the Venice Commission, but every phrase of political leaders who were not consistent in their conclusions. Yatsenyuk in 2011 says that there was a total usurpation of power. In 2012 he says we will not allow it to happen. He says that we can say something now. A year ago he said that that's the end, that there was a constitutional upsurge, and mass media use only the words of politicians as information event. But in media discussion we don't see any expert discussion. There were very, very few articles where experts would be invited, lawyers, experts in constitution law, but all the words of political leaders, especially of oppositional leaders, start the wave of discussions in mass media.
Here, on this slide, we see discussions and discourse from 2012. There are more media presentations that usurpation is a fact, but lesser is the percentage of the threat of usurpation. How do we distinguish between these all statements? When people say that we would not allow the usurpation of power to happen, we classify this as a threat of usurpation. But when there is a direct statement that we should counteract usurpation, that this proves that usurpation had happened. this is the structure of discussion about usurpation in Ukrainian mass media before Euromaidan events. In course of our analysis, we found out that mass media were enabled to predict the protests. In the Ukrainian mass media, up to the very beginning of Euromaidan, there were no predictions about protests. Mass media continuously stated that we need just one leader and predicted that any protest will immediately die. Coming now about dynamics. Dynamics of the increasing of usurpation signals in Ukrainian mass media. In 2013, considerable rise of mentions about usurpation in mass media happened. Then a slight decline started in 2014. This is an example of self-censorship. This schedule, this chart shows, presents the same information in split into 6 months. I'm not sure what might be the major conclusion out of this research. It poses more questions than provides answers. Actually, there were no public discussion about usurpation, and mass media did not raise this issue. So they should share responsibility for silence on this topic, because mass media forms events, forms personalities. They can produce newsmakers or destroy them. And I believe that today, when we are so sensitive to censorship, to self-censorship in mass media, probably this research might be very useful for us from the point of view of the lessons from our past. Maybe Dmytro will say a couple of words of the main conclusions. I fully agree with Yevgenia. When mass media keeps silence, it's a problem. But the biggest problem is when mass media provide disinformation. When Yevgenia mentioned about usurpation or non-usurpation, it was interesting to hear that part of mass media informed readers about usurpation as a fact, as a happened fact. At the same time, the same mass media continued to call the president who usurped power as a president, which was not the case. He should be called not the president, the legal president of the country. He should be called a dictator, leader, a clown, but not a but not a legal president. I think that our country still suffers from the lack of democracy. We still have the same problem with legitimacy of power as in many other serious countries. So in Eastern neighborhood countries, political analysts should pay attention to their texts, whether they effectively legitimize usurpers, whether they, via their texts, they decrease the chance for non-violent removal of usurpers. The law enforcers should remember that they are subordinated to illegal leaders if the fact of usurpation occurs. Will you please show the next slide? Here you see the presentation with percentages. This is 2010. You see 10% mentioned that there were no usurpation. This was an attempt to convince people that there were no usurpation. Although the National Anti-Corruption Bureau currently carries out an investigation about financial side of this usurpation. 69% of mass media kept talking about the threat of usurpation, while only 21 publications mentioned about usurpation as a real fact. The threat of usurpation actually means that there is no usurpation as a real fact. That's why the talks about the threat of usurpation shows that we never thought about violation of Article 5 of our Constitution or Article 109 of the Criminal Code, which provides which stipulates for responsibility for usurpation of power. In 2011, the percentages are slightly different. We less discussed the absence of usurpation and more mentioned about the fact of usurpation, 36%. In 2012, the trend is growing. When we look at the absolute figures, we see that the percentage of understanding people, understanding the situation, had grown. But journalists who presented this fact in mass media went down. You saw the chart in 2012. Everybody forgot that some years before that the power had been conquered. 2013, no usurpation, 6%, the fact of usurpation, 38%, and only 56% about the threat of usurpation. I think this formulation, the threat of usurpation, is insufficiently clear. Our recommendations are quite simple. We have to carry on similar research. This research was focused on journalists, on mass media. Of course, we wish not to say that journalists should be responsible for what happened in Maidan. Yanukovych is responsible for what happened in Maidan. But journalists have to present truth and to cover the situation adequately, but advocates of human rights, lawyers, politicians had to bring this issue into agenda earlier, back in 2010, and probably back in 2010 it would be possible to resolve the issue with the legal usurpation of power, just like it happened in 2004. When part of law enforcers took the side of the legal president, and when all mass media kept saying that Yanukovych was illegal. Also, we should continue our research of conditions for censorship and self-censorship. We should keep in mind the theory of social transformations. We have to change the approach of theoreticians and of legal authorities to usurpation. Diplomats, the democracy promoting organizations had to discuss this issue with sponsors. We have to review the preconditions for usurpation in the world, and we have to introduce to the educational system a special training course. Maybe it should be optional course, but we should offer students this opportunity how to distinguish the attempt to usurp power and how to prevent it. Thank you, Dmytro.
Time for one or two questions. Any questions?
Будь ласка, лаконічно представляйтесь.
Please introduce yourself.
Сергій Кутняков, агенція
Moninform Agency. What do you believe is the mechanism of influence at mass media to adjust the editorial policy to the proposals that you've mentioned? If the journalist standards are violated, well, I'm interested in your opinion. I wouldn't be giving recommendations to journalists. And the editors, I believe, they themselves should know how to implement the standards of journalist ethics into the profession. They shouldn't be lying. They should be informing about the events. In 2013, we lacked information about usurpation of power. There was the falsification of the constitution. Now there are grounds to believe that the results of the presidential elections in 2010 were also falsified. We believe there will be investigations of that, but the journalists know how to write about that. I would like Yengeniya to give comments on that because she's the former journalist. We do not really assess correctly the individual decision of the journalist. The journalist decides himself or herself whether to write or not about something. There should be the editorial policy, but it's not like we stop calling Yanukovych the president, but there should be the freedom of individual decision. But for individual decision to take place, for that we need an expert community. Journalists are not experts. Journalists are to create this environment. They need to create the discussion in the society. That is why we are talking about education. Every person should be able to notice the situation and to decide how to write about that. Thank you, Dmytro. Thank you, Yevgenia. If you have some other questions, you can ask them off record. The next event